The summer sun beat down on the cobblestones outside the palace gates, where tourists from around the world gathered to catch a glimpse of Britain's famous traditions. Among the sea of excited faces and clicking cameras stood Royal Guard James Harrison, his posture perfect and his uniform immaculate, just as it had been every day for the past 3 years. The weight of his ceremonial baskin hat was familiar now, though he remembered how heavy it felt during his first weeks on duty. The morning had started like any other. He polished his boots until they gleamed like mirrors, adjusted his red tunic with practiced precision, and took his position with the same pride he'd felt since his first day on the job. At 32, Harrison had already packed quite a life story into his years. Before joining the Royal Guard, he'd served 8 years in the military, including 2 tours overseas where he'd earned multiple commendations for his leadership and courage under fire. But standing guard at one of Britain's most iconic locations brought a different kind of satisfaction. He was now part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, representing something bigger than himself. Groups of tourists moved past his post in waves. He could hear snippets of different languages: French, Japanese, Spanish, German, all blending together in the summer air. Children pointed and waved, trying to make him smile or blink. Parents posed beside him for photos, careful to maintain the respectful distance required by protocol. He kept his eyes forward, face neutral, just as he'd been trained. A young girl in a bright yellow dress caught his attention as she tugged on her mother's sleeve. "But why don't they move?" she asked loudly in an American accent. Her mother explained in a hushed voice about discipline and tradition, while Harrison fought to keep the corner of his mouth from twitching into a smile. These little moments, though they couldn't show it, were part of what made the job special. The morning crowd was larger than usual, probably because of the perfect weather. The forecasted rain had held off, leaving behind one of those rare, cloudless London days that seemed to bring the whole world to their doorstep. Tour guides led their groups past, sharing facts about the palace and the guards, some true, some embellished for entertainment. Harrison had learned to tune out most of it, though occasionally he'd catch a particularly creative piece of made-up history that would test his ability to keep a straight face. He'd just completed his 20th mental check of his uniform, a habit from his military days, when he noticed a shift in the crowd's energy. A man's voice, louder than the respectful murmur that usually filled the air, caught his attention. Something about the tone made Harrison's trained instincts kick in, though his expression remained unchanged. Through his peripheral vision, he could see other tourists starting to look uncomfortable. A group of Japanese visitors began moving away from the source of the disruption, their excited chatter falling silent. A mother pulled her children closer, steering them toward a different area of the grounds. The voice grew louder, more aggressive, and Harrison could now make out words that made his stomach tighten. Years of military and guard training had taught him to read situations without moving a muscle. Every sense was alert now, though to any observer he remained as still as the palace walls behind him. The voice was getting closer, and with it came that familiar tension he'd known from his military days, the calm before a storm. Other tourists were now openly staring at something behind the crowd, their cameras lowering as entertainment turned to concern. A pair of palace security officers in the distance had noticed too, their casual patrol becoming more purposeful as they moved toward the disturbance. Harrison maintained his pose, but beneath the ceremonial uniform, his muscles tensed slightly, ready for whatever might come next. The summer air felt heavier now, charged with an energy that didn't belong among the usual tourist excitement. Harrison knew that most visitors saw the guards as living statues, part of the pageantry of the palace. Few realized that beneath the ceremonial exterior stood highly trained military personnel capable of switching from ceremonial sentry to active defender in a heartbeat. As the disruptive voice grew closer and clearer, Harrison had a feeling that someone was about to learn that lesson the hard way. In that moment, as the situation began to unfold, Harrison reflected on his training officer's words from years ago. The uniform represents centuries of history, but the person wearing it represents its living purpose. Those words had never felt more relevant than they did right now, as he stood at his post, ready for whatever challenge was about to present itself on this otherwise perfect London morning. The man pushed his way through the crowd, his face flushed red with anger that seemed to have nothing to do with the summer heat. He was well dressed in expensive tourist clothes, crisp khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's entire outfits, but his behavior was anything but refined. A half-empty water bottle swung wildly in his hand as he gestured, sending drops flying onto nearby tourists who quickly stepped away. "This isn't what I came to see," he announced loudly, his accent marking him as American. The words slurred slightly, suggesting his water bottle might have contained something stronger than water. A few teenage tourists quickly pocketed their phones, their excitement about seeing the famous guards replaced by discomfort at the unfolding scene. An elderly British woman in a floral dress turned to her companion and whispered, "Someone ought to fetch the police." Her friend nodded in agreement, but neither moved, trapped in that very human moment of knowing something should be done, but being unsure about doing it themselves. The atmosphere around the palace gates had transformed completely. The usual buzz of excitement was replaced by an uncomfortable tension, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Parents guided their children behind them, and tour guides tried to distract their groups by pointing out architectural features in the opposite direction. Harrison remained motionless at his post, but his trained eye caught everything. He noticed how the palace security officers were now speaking quietly into their radios, how the regular police officers who patrolled the area were beginning to take notice. He saw an older American couple, probably from the same tour group as the troublemaker, trying to calm the man down. "Come on, let's go get some lunch," the older gentleman suggested, reaching for the angry man's arm. "They've got those fish and chips you wanted to try." But the suggestion only seemed to fuel the man's anger. "Don't touch me," he snapped, jerking his arm away so violently that he stumbled slightly. "I paid good money to see this place. My grandfather fought in the war for this country, and this is what they're showing tourists." A young couple who had been taking selfies quickly gathered their things and hurried away. The man's voice was getting louder, and now his words took an ugly turn. Comments about traditional values and standards started carrying unmistakable undertones of racism, making the remaining crowd even more uncomfortable. Two Asian tourists who had been photographing the palace architecture quietly packed away their expensive camera equipment and moved away from the scene. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip were quickly redirected by their teachers, their excited chatter falling silent as they sensed the adults' concern. Through it all, Harrison maintained his stance, but beneath his ceremonial uniform, every muscle was alert. His military training had taught him to read people, to sense when situations were about to escalate beyond words. The man's body language was becoming more aggressive, shoulders squared, gestures increasingly animated, steps becoming less steady but more purposeful. The historic palace grounds had seen centuries of history, but today they were witnessing something that didn't belong in any era. The beautiful summer morning had taken a dark turn, and the gathered crowd could sense it. Some began to film discreetly with their phones, while others looked around nervously for authority figures to step in. A young mother quickly gathered her children, one of whom was asking in a loud whisper, "Mummy, why is that man so angry?" The question hung in the air, its innocence a stark contrast to the ugliness of the moment. The mother didn't answer, just hurried her family away from the scene, joining the steady stream of tourists who decided this wasn't the holiday memory they wanted to keep. Harrison could hear the palace security team coordinating through their earpieces. Help was coming, but not fast enough to prevent what was clearly building to a confrontation. Years of experience told him that this situation was reaching a tipping point. The man was now close enough that Harrison could smell the alcohol on his breath, could see the redness in his eyes, could sense the moment approaching when ceremony would have to give way to security. The summer breeze carried snippets of concerned whispers from the remaining crowd. "Should we do something? Where are the police? This isn't right." But for now, all eyes were fixed on the unfolding scene, watching as a perfect London morning teetered on the edge of chaos, waiting to see what would happen when tradition collided with intolerance. The tourist's footsteps echoed against the cobblestones as he crossed the invisible line that separated spectators from the guard's post. A collective gasp rose from the remaining onlookers. Everyone knew the rules about maintaining distance from the royal guards. Even children understood this basic protocol. "Hey you, I'm talking to you." The man's voice carried the false courage of someone who'd had too much to drink. He planted himself directly in front of Harrison, close enough that the guard could see the sweat beading on the man's forehead. The expensive polo shirt was now stained with dark patches under the arms, and his carefully styled hair had become disheveled in the summer heat. Harrison's training kicked in automatically. His eyes remained focused straight ahead, looking through the man as if he were invisible. This was standard procedure. Guards were taught to maintain their composure no matter the provocation. But beneath the ceremonial uniform, every sense was heightened, reading the situation with military precision. "What's wrong? Can't even look at me." The tourist's words carried a nasty edge that made nearby pigeons scatter. A young couple who had been watching from nearby quickly retreated, the woman pulling out her phone to call for help. The remaining crowd had thinned to about 20 people, most filming with their phones from what they hoped was a safe distance. An older security guard appeared at the edge of the scene, speaking urgently into his radio. 2 police officers were visible in the distance, making their way through the palace grounds, but they were still too far to intervene. The situation was escalating faster than help could arrive. The tourist began a stream of insults, each one more offensive than the last. His words targeted Harrison's race, his role, his uniform, everything he could think of to provoke a reaction. Other tourists looked away in embarrassment and disgust, but Harrison remained motionless, his face a mask of professional calm. Years of military service had taught him that true strength often meant not reacting at all. A group of British teenagers nearby muttered words of support for Harrison, their phones recording everything. "He's proper brave, he is," one whispered to his friends. "I'd have decked that guy already." His friends nodded in agreement, their young faces showing a mix of anger and admiration. The tourist's next move shocked everyone. He pulled out his own phone and held it inches from Harrison's face, the camera flash going off repeatedly. "Come on, smile for me. Show everyone what a joke this whole thing is." His hand was shaking with anger or alcohol or both, the phone's brightness reflecting off Harrison's polished buttons. 2 middle-aged women who had been watching in horror finally found their courage. "Stop it," one of them called out. "Leave him alone." The other added, "You're embarrassing yourself and your country." But their words only seemed to fuel the man's rage. He turned to face the women, gesturing wildly with his phone. "Mind your own business. This is between me and him." The motion caused him to stumble slightly, and when he turned back to Harrison, his face had grown even redder. "You think you're better than me because of this costume, huh?" The palace grounds had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual sounds of London traffic seemed muffled, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The summer air felt thick with tension, and time seemed to slow down. Everyone could sense that something was about to break. Harrison maintained his position, but his military-trained mind was running through scenarios, calculating options, preparing for what might come next. The ceremonial uniform might look decorative, but underneath was a highly trained soldier who had faced worse situations in active service. A young boy in the crowd tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why isn't anybody stopping him?" The father, his face tight with concern, pulled his son back a few steps. "The police are coming," he whispered, but his eyes never left the scene. Sometimes you have to let bad people show exactly who they are. The tourist was now so close that his ranting had become almost incoherent, a mix of personal frustrations and deep-seated prejudices pouring out in a toxic stream. His gestures became more erratic, his movements more unpredictable. The phone in his hand had become more weapon than camera, swinging dangerously close to Harrison's face with each angry gesture. The approaching police officers had broken into a run, sensing the situation was about to cross a line. But they were still too far away. The security guard was edging closer, but he was an older man, clearly uncertain about confronting someone in such a state of rage. Everything was building to a breaking point. The crowd could feel it. The police could see it. And Harrison, standing perfectly still at his post, knew it. Years of training had taught him to recognize the moment when ceremony must give way to duty. That moment was coming, and it was coming fast. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The tourist, frustrated by Harrison's continued silence, made the worst decision of his day. He reached out to grab the guard's uniform. His fingers caught the bright red fabric of the ceremonial tunic, yanking hard enough to pull it slightly askew. That single action changed everything. The moment hands touched the uniform, the rules of engagement shifted. Harrison's military training took over with fluid precision. In one smooth motion, his ceremonial stance transformed into a defensive position, each movement calculated and controlled. The tourist's eyes widened in shock. Like many before him, he'd made the mistake of thinking the guards were just for show. He'd forgotten, or never known, that beneath the ceremonial uniform stood a highly trained military professional. The realization came too late. Harrison's response was textbook perfect: minimum force, maximum control. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, breaking the tourist's grip on his uniform while simultaneously creating a safe distance between them. The movement was so precise it almost looked choreographed, like a dance step practiced 1,000 times. The tourist stumbled backward, more from surprise than force. His phone clattered to the cobblestones, the screen cracking on impact. The sound seemed to echo across the suddenly silent palace grounds. The crowd, which had been filming and murmuring, collectively held their breath. "Don't you dare touch me!" the tourist shouted, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. He tried to regain his balance, his designer shoes slipping slightly on the smooth stones. The alcohol in his system made his movements clumsy, a sharp contrast to Harrison's precise control. Two police officers were now sprinting toward the scene, their boots heavy on the cobblestones. But Harrison didn't need their help. His training had prepared him for far worse situations than an angry, drunk tourist. Each movement was measured, each response proportional. The tourist, his pride wounded more than anything else, made another poor choice. He lunged forward, arms outstretched, aiming to shove the guard. Harrison sidestepped with military precision, using the tourist's own momentum to guide him safely to the ground. The move was so smooth that some in the crowd gasped in appreciation. "He's not even breaking a sweat," whispered one of the teenagers who'd been filming. The comment carried in the quiet air, causing a ripple of nervous laughter from the onlookers. The tourist lay on the ground, the fight gone out of him, his expensive clothes now dusty from the cobblestones. The police officers arrived at the scene, slightly out of breath. They found an unusual sight. The tourist sitting on the ground, looking dazed, while Harrison had already resumed his ceremonial stance, as if nothing had happened. Only his slightly askew uniform suggested there had been any confrontation at all. An older gentleman in the crowd spoke up, his British accent crisp and clear. "I saw everything, officers. This man," he pointed to the tourist, "was the aggressor." The guards showed remarkable restraint. Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, many holding up their phones to show the recorded evidence. The tourist, now being helped to his feet by the police, had undergone a remarkable transformation. Gone was the aggressive bravado, replaced by the sheepish look of someone who had severely miscalculated. His face was red not from anger now, but from embarrassment. One of the officers carefully picked up the tourist's cracked phone while his partner began the formal process of arrest. The crowd watched as handcuffs were produced, the metal catching the summer sunlight. Some people were still filming, but most had lowered their phones, the excitement giving way to a kind of collective relief. A young girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet aftermath. "Mummy, is the guard okay?" she asked. Her mother smiled, seeing Harrison standing tall and composed at his post. "Yes, dear," she replied. "I think he's just fine." The tourist was led away by the police, his head down, all his previous bluster gone. As he passed the guard post, Harrison remained perfectly still, his eyes forward, every inch the professional. The only sign of the confrontation was a slight wrinkle in his red tunic, a wrinkle that, knowing the standards of the Royal Guard, would bother Harrison far more than the actual incident. The summer breeze returned to the palace grounds, carrying away the last traces of tension. Tourists began to relax, sharing glances and quiet conversations about what they'd witnessed. Many were already sharing their videos, knowing this would be a holiday story worth telling for years to come. The next few minutes unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed play. Additional police officers arrived on scene, their fluorescent yellow vests bright against the palace's historic stones. They moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, gathering statements from witnesses who were eager to share what they'd seen. "It was amazing," a university student told one of the officers, showing them the video on his phone. "The guard didn't do anything wrong. He just stopped the attack, simple as that. Around him, other tourists nodded in agreement, many offering their own recordings as evidence. The officer took down contact details and email addresses, building a clear picture of what had happened. Harrison remained at his post, his posture perfect once again. Only the smallest details. A slight wrinkle in his uniform, a thin layer of dust on one sleeve, hinted at what had just occurred. A senior palace official had appeared, speaking quietly into a radio while assessing the situation. His presence added another layer of authority to the scene. The tourist crowd had changed character completely. Gone was the usual holiday atmosphere of excited chatter and camera clicks. Instead, people spoke in hushed, respectful tones, many expressing admiration for Harrison's composure. A group of British military veterans, identifiable by their regimental caps, stood nearby, nodding in quiet approval. "That's how it's done," one veteran murmured to his companions. "Clean, professional, no drama." His friends agreed, their experienced eyes having caught the precise nature of Harrison's defensive moves. They understood better than most the level of training required to handle such a situation with such control. Palace security had established a wider perimeter now, giving Harrison space to maintain his duty. A young security officer approached with a cloth, offering to help clean the dust from the guard's uniform, but Harrison gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. Protocol dictated he maintain his post unless directly ordered otherwise. Two police officers were interviewing an elderly couple who had witnessed everything from the beginning. The woman spoke with emotion, her British accent filled with indignation. "We come here every Sunday for a walk, and we've never seen anything like it." That young man, she gestured toward Harrison, showed remarkable restraint. "He's a credit to the uniform." The summer day continued around them. Above, clouds drifted past the palace towers, and somewhere in the distance, a tour guide could be heard explaining the history of the building to a new group of visitors. But here, at this spot, time seemed to move differently. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something significant. A senior guard officer appeared, his pace measured but purposeful. He spoke briefly with the police and palace security before approaching Harrison. Their exchange was brief and professional, just a few quiet words. Those close enough could see Harrison's response, a single, crisp "yes, sir," that carried all the weight of his military training. Around the edges of the scene, life was beginning to return to normal. New tourists were arriving, unaware of what had transpired just minutes before. They found themselves walking into an unusual atmosphere, part tension, part relief, part pride. The story was already spreading through the crowd, passed from person to person like a modern folk tale. A young boy who had watched everything turned to his father with wide eyes. "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be just like him." The father looked at Harrison, still standing tall and dignified at his post, then back at his son. "It's not just about wearing the uniform," he explained quietly. "It's about wearing it with honor." The police were finishing their initial investigation, their notebooks filled with witness statements and contact information. The tourist who had caused the trouble was long gone, taken to the station in a police car, his holiday plans dramatically altered. But Harrison's shift continued, his dedication unchanged by the incident. As the crowd began to thin, a palace tour guide gathered her group nearby. She paused in her usual script about the building's history to add something new. "What you see here," she said, gesturing respectfully toward Harrison, "is the true meaning of the phrase grace under pressure. These guards aren't just ceremonial figures, they're highly trained professionals who deserve our complete respect." By evening, videos of the incident had spread across every social media platform imaginable. People around the world watched the clips, sharing them with comments of support and admiration for the guards' professionalism. What started as a local incident had become a global conversation about respect, duty, and standing up to intolerance. The first viral video appeared on Twitter, posted by one of the teenagers who had witnessed everything. "Most incredible thing I've ever seen," read the caption. "Royal Guard keeps his cool and handles racist perfectly." Within hours, the post had gathered millions of views, with people from every continent adding their thoughts and reactions. Inside the palace's security office, phones were ringing constantly. News organizations from around the world wanted statements, details, anything they could get about the incident. The palace's press team had already prepared a brief, dignified response. An incident occurred involving a member of the King's Guard. The situation was handled according to protocol, and the matter has been referred to the appropriate authorities. But social media told the real story. Tourism websites that usually focused on London's historic sites were flooded with comments from people who had been there. A French tourist's blog post went viral. "We witnessed true dignity today. This guard showed us what it means to be a professional." The post was translated into dozens of languages, shared thousands of times. Military veterans groups online were particularly vocal in their support. "This is exactly how it's done," wrote a former Royal Marine on his popular blog. "Minimum force, maximum control. This guard did everything by the book, protecting himself and the tourist from serious harm. That's what real training looks like." A group of tourists who had been present created an online forum thread titled "We Were There," sharing their personal accounts of what happened. Their stories painted a vivid picture of the scene, each from a slightly different angle, but all highlighting the guard's remarkable composure. "My hands were shaking as I filmed it," wrote one tourist from Canada, but the guard never lost his cool, not even for a second. "When he had to act, it was like watching a masterclass in professional restraint." The comment section filled with similar observations from others who had witnessed the event. Local London newspapers picked up the story for their evening editions. "WNITY under fire," read one headline, accompanied by a respectful photograph of the palace guards at their posts. The articles focused not on the confrontation itself, but on the exemplary way it had been handled. Online discussions sparked broader conversations about respect for traditions and the people who uphold them. A popular history channel created a quick video explaining the role and training of the King's Guard, helping viewers understand that these weren't just ceremonial figures but highly trained military personnel. Teachers from around the world shared the story in their classrooms, using it as a lesson in professionalism and standing up to prejudice. A high school in Australia had their students write essays about maintaining composure under pressure, using the guard's response as their central example. The tourist's foam video, the one he'd been filming to mock the guard, had survived its fall to the cobblestones. When police reviewed it, it showed something unexpected, the exact moment when misplaced arrogance met professional training. The footage would later be used in training sessions for security personnel as an example of perfect protocol under pressure. By nightfall, several online campaigns had started, calling for the guard to receive formal recognition for his handling of the situation. "Dignity in the face of hatred deserves to be honored," wrote one petition organizer. The signatures came pouring in from people touched by the guard's remarkable restraint. Security experts appeared on evening news programs, explaining to viewers just how perfectly the situation had been handled. "Notice how he used only the necessary force to control the situation," one expert pointed out. "That's years of training in action. He protected himself, protected the aggressor from serious injury, and maintained the dignity of his position. That's not easy to do." Meanwhile, back at the palace, Harrison's fellow guards had heard about the incident. In their private quarters, away from the public eye, they expressed their pride in how he'd handled the situation. There were no grand speeches or celebrations, just the quiet approval of professionals who understood exactly what it took to maintain such perfect control. A week after the incident, life at the palace had returned to its normal rhythm. Tourists still gathered to watch the guards, take photos, and marvel at the pageantry of British tradition. But there was something different in the air, a new sense of respect and understanding among the visitors. The tourist who had caused the incident appeared in court, looking very different from the aggressive figure in the viral videos. Wearing a subdued suit and tie, he stood quietly as the charges were read. His lawyer presented a written apology to the court, expressing deep remorse for his client's actions. The judge's response was firm but fair: a substantial fine, mandatory cultural sensitivity training, and a ban from approaching the palace grounds for 5 years. Back at the palace, Harrison's commanding officer had called him in for a private meeting. "The way you handled that situation," the officer said, looking at the commendation letter on his desk, "that's exactly what we trained for. You protected everyone involved, including the tourist himself, while maintaining the dignity of your position." Harrison stood at attention, his uniform as pristine as ever, accepting the praise with characteristic modesty. The incident had sparked some positive changes. Palace security had updated their training protocols, using video footage of Harrison's response as an example of perfect procedure. "This is how we handle provocations," instructors would tell new recruits. Calm, professional, minimal force. The lesson wasn't just about physical control, it was about maintaining composure under the most challenging circumstances. Tour companies around London had added new information to their guidebooks and presentations. The King's Guard are active duty soldiers, guides would explain to their groups. While they perform a ceremonial role, they are highly trained military personnel who deserve our complete respect. Many included the story of Harrison's response as an example, though they were careful to keep his name private, respecting his wish to avoid personal attention. In police stations across London, the incident became a teaching moment. Notice how he creates distance without escalation, trainers would point out while reviewing the footage. How he controls the situation without causing harm. That's the standard we aim for. The video became part of their training materials, showing how to handle confrontations with minimum force and maximum professionalism. One morning, an elderly gentleman approached the palace gates, leaning on his walking stick. He was a retired military officer who had served decades ago. Looking at Harrison standing at his post, the old soldier smiled and gave a subtle nod of recognition, one professional to another. No words were needed. The gesture carried all the weight of shared understanding about duty, honor, and service. Schools had picked up the story too, using it in lessons about respect and standing up to prejudice. A teacher in London had her students write essays about maintaining dignity under pressure. "Remember," she told her class, "true strength isn't about fighting back, it's about knowing when and how to respond appropriately." The tourist's viral video had accumulated millions of views, but not for the reasons he'd intended. Instead, it had become a powerful example of professionalism triumphing over prejudice. Comments beneath the video praised the guard's composure and condemned the tourist's behavior, turning a potential moment of shame into a lesson about respect. Harrison himself had received hundreds of letters of support, all professionally handled through military channels. He read each one, touched by the global outpouring of respect, though he never sought recognition for his actions. To him, he had simply done his job, upholding the standards and traditions he had sworn to protect. As autumn approached, bringing cooler air to London, the incident had become part of palace law. New guards heard the story during their training, understanding that their role went beyond ceremonial duties. They were the living embodiment of centuries of tradition, requiring not just physical training but moral courage. The final word came from an unexpected source. A young student, visiting the palace with his school, looked up at Harrison standing at his post. "My dad says you're a hero," the boy said quietly, "not because you stopped the Batman, but because you showed him a better way to be." Harrison maintained his professional stance, but inside, he felt the truth of those words. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from what we do, but from how we choose to do it.